Hey everyone, Ashley Mailloux and Mike Beer here with a special Pick 5 preview for this Saturday out at Churchill Downs. The wagering menu, Mike, there's a lot of opportunities to make some money on the card. And we're going to focus in on the Pick 5 that starts in race 8, which is the Pat Day Mile Grade 2 event for 600,000. No chump change here by any means. And a big field. And I don't know what your initial thoughts were with this being a one-turn mile. I think there's some interesting moves from horses cutting back to at least a one-turn mile compared to a two-turn. A couple of other horses stretching out.
Yeah, I kind of feel like that's the whole key here. Some of these horses who have been concentrating on the longer races, which is, let's be honest, it's what you do with a talented 3-year-old earlier in their career. You see how far they can get because you want to try to point for those big purse races routing as time goes on. If it doesn't work, though, at this time of the year, you can start cutting them back in distance. And that's what you're getting a lot in this race. There are talented horses in here, and I think several of them can benefit from cutting back a little bit in distance.
Yeah, one of those horses being Top Connor, the morning line favorite at 5-2, comes out of the Bluegrass. Tried a mile at Gulfstream, a mile and an eighth at Keeneland. Now cuts back. Obviously, he's got experience at a one-turn mile. But I thought a horse that's intriguing for at least our first replay here is the number 7, Who Day. This one of the Thomas Drury Jr. barn. It ends up being this runner-up here in the Lafayette back at the beginning of April. I thought it was a nice way to kick off his 3-year-old season. It's the only time we've seen him. Glenn Gary, I think, is a very neat, nifty horse who's been able to do quite well so far in his career. And he comes up second best, but he's going to be clear here of Frosty Indulgence, who he has to face again in the Pat Day Mile. And he's a horse that has that trip at Churchill with a win at the mile.
Yeah, I'm glad you pulled this replay too, because I feel like this is a really interesting horse in this race. And I thought he ran really well in that Lafayette that we just watched there. He basically had no chance with a horse who just dominated that race on the lead. I thought he did really well to get up for second. I liked a lot of his races as a 2-year-old too. He can be a difficult horse to ride, it looks like, but I feel like he fits this race really well, and he should be a very fair price in this field.
Yeah, and he's a horse. I mean, he's an Ohio bred. Look at his resume. He's taken his show everywhere. And I think getting defeated at Keeneland certainly isn't anything against him. Now, we'll pull another replay here. I'm curious to pick your brain on the outside runner, the 12 Nash. And as we look at his most recent performance, he ends up getting another win, his second career win in the $200,000 Hot Springs down at Oaklawn Park. And he did everything right in this event. He was coming out of those races at the fairgrounds where to me, he should have shown more. He went off favorite in those races. I think everyone was very hot on this horse from his maiden score that came at Churchill. He was a big, big winner there. But to me, he's had those defeats in between. He comes in here off of win. I just don't know what to make out of him.
He's a tough call. I agree with you. He's a tough call in here because I feel like there is a way to look at him. Even though he lost several races at shorter prices, and you feel like maybe he didn't have any excuses in those races, is he ultimately one of those horses we were talking about in the Open, though, who just doesn't want to go that far? And so cutting back in distance and getting back around one turn, could it really help this horse? And by the way, he may not need that much help because he's already run several really fast races. His pedigree says shorter is better. And so I wonder if they're finally just starting to run him in the right races. I'm not going to sit here and suggest that you have to love this horse as one of the favorites in here. But I also don't think you should be surprised when he really appreciates a one-turn mile and runs big once again in this spot.
Nash is 3-1 on the morning line. For Laurent Giroux has the call here at 4. Trainer Brad Cox. Anyone else in this field that you thought was worth a long look?
I mean, not really. I mean, I'm pretty high on Who Day. I'm a big fan of that horse. I personally feel like the morning line favorite. And again, I don't feel like you have to settle for short prices in here, but I feel like Top Connor has a chance to be a really, really good horse as time goes on. I understand why they took the shot in the Bluegrass last time. And to me, that was never going to work out, especially when you add in the trip that he pulled in there, just sort of cutting a fast pace. I think this horse has a chance to be really good. And I think he's going to be really tough on this field if he gets the right trip.
You mentioned Top Connor, 5-2 on the morning line. We'll move on to the second leg of the sequence, race number 9, the Grade 2 American Turf Stakes, a mile and a 16th on the turf. And a big field to kind of talk about here. I thought this was wide open. You're getting 3-year-olds going long on the turf at Churchill. There's a lot to like, but I only pulled one replay here, Mike, and it's of neat. And it's not just neat in this field. You can see the second and third place finishers. Also, a lot of horses exit the Grade 3 Transylvania at Keeneland. And it was his first start since the yielding trip at Sam Houston, where he was a runaway winner. And I thought this was a great ride from Mailloux Gutierrez to get this horse in the right spot. And he gets up just in time. It's a very narrow win margin.
Yeah, it is, but he runs really well in this race. I agree with you. And this is the right replay to pull too. The 5 of these horses are going to come back in this race on Saturday, and they all actually ran pretty well in this American turf too. They're all around it at the end. But it was Neat who ultimately did get into the right spot, but man, was he a handful early in that race, just pulling, trying to run off on the lead. And you, as you mentioned, his rider did a really good job to get him into the pocket there, and he just got up at the end. I feel like that's a really important race to decipher when you're talking about this race. And I'm going to leave it to you to break that one down. I kind of decided that I'm going to stay away from those horses in here. Not that I'll be shocked when they run well. I think the key to the race is the 5, Legend of Time. He'll probably be the favorite. Godolphin, Appleby, shipping over here. All of his races so far in his career are really good. And he's a handy horse. I just sort of felt like he was the horse to beat. So I have to use that horse, I feel like. And then I'm going to stay away from the horses that we just watched in that Transylvania replay. And I'm going to use one other horse in this race just because I'm very intrigued by the number 4, Formidable Man. He's going to be a big price in this race. I think there's a good trip coming for him in here. And I like everything about what this horse has done on turf so far. His most recent win was a really good performance, I thought.
You mentioned winning at 1.125 at Santa Anita for Michael McCarthy. I think it's interesting. I like the rider too. Luis Saez climbs aboard at this one in this spot. I think they'll team up very well. And, I think there is 2 ways to look at the Transylvania. I liked Neat's performance. I know this horse was a handful, but Mailloux is familiar with the horse. And I think the big thing that Neat was able to do is kind of revert to his tactics that we saw late as a 2-year-old, where he could sit just off the pace. And I think it comes down to trip in this spot. There's some other horses in here that I think might take some love. I'm curious to see if Set, the 10, will take love in here. I know this horse, there was some talk about in terms of last time out, he went off heavily favored, high hopes in the Cutler Bay, and he won. But he's going from 7.5 at Gulfstream, a 2-turn 7.5, to this field. He's getting tested for class. He's 10-1 on the morning line. I wouldn't be surprised to see him, take some respect. And I was of the feeling here, maybe you use 2 or 3 horses, or if not, you have to spread because, as you mentioned, so many are coming out of the Transylvania where they made up a ton of ground late. Now, middle leg of the sequence, race number 10. This is a tricky race. It's the Grade 1 Churchill Downstakes, 7 furlongs here on the main track, 4-year-olds and upward, and field of 11 here. And I don't know what your thoughts on this race as a whole was, but I found this tricky. I felt, again, this is either you have to go light or you have to spread in this field.
100%. I thought this was the toughest race in the entire sequence. I really don't have a good idea of how the trips are going to work out here. I don't really have a good idea of what the pace is going to look like. It feels like there's not a ton of speed in here for a race that's a Grade 1 going 7 furlongs. You sort of expect that there would be more pace. There's really not. Even as I say that, though, I sort of feel like you are going to get speed out of horses like the 6 Zozos and the 11 Hoist the Gold. Maybe a couple others will go. So I don't know, man. I don't think anybody in this field is that good. And I'm not sure how the trips are going to work out. I kind of sort of wanted to fade the favorites as much as I could in this race. I get that Hoist the Gold and Zozos are the 2 morning line favorites. I get that they could win in this race. I'm not a big fan of either one of these 2 horses. I don't feel like they hold any edge on this field. And so ultimately I decided I'm going to try to fade those guys and look for some other horses to use.
Yeah, I was of the opinion that Zozos, Hoist the Gold, if I was going to use one of them, which I did, I was only going to use one of them. And I did go to Hoist the Gold, had a couple of reservations with Zozos off the layoff. And just knowing that Hoist the Gold, I mean, he can kind of be at his best occasionally. And we've seen that. He's had some breakthrough performances. He drew the outside. And here I like that Johnny V, decides to stick with him here. Look at his last 2 wins. He's been aboard for those. So I used him. I think, a horse that I found really interesting is the 10 Gun Pilot. I just think Steve Asmussen sprints. I think that he gets these horses, he gets a lot out of them and kind of sets them up. And to me, he was a horse that I thought would be intriguing at the 7/8 distance.
We're right on the same page with that horse. I thought he was a very interesting long shot in here. I can see myself talking myself into a win bet on him on Saturday at a big price. I agree with you. I feel like they tried to stretch him out last year. It didn't happen. He seems like he's way better sprinting, and he's getting better with every start so far this year. I definitely want to use him. I definitely want to use 3 Technique at a price. He's a horse who I think is good enough to beat this field. He needs a trip. He hasn't gotten very much pace to run at in some of his recent starts, but if there's a little pace in here, I think he can be there at the end. So I'm going to use that horse. I feel like we're sort of remiss not talking about Tejano Twist in this race. I get that he's a deep closer, but he might be in the best form of anybody right now. We'll see, if he can pull the right trip in this race, but I feel like I kind of have to use him just because he just might be the best sprinter in this field. And then a wild card for me is the 4, Mr. Wireless. I don't know. I think he's another horse. Maybe they might have just been prepping off the layoff last time. It was a long layoff. They went 6 furlongs. Maybe they found something out about this horse, though. Maybe he's better going shorter.
And one other horse to point out, I'll be honest, I didn't use him on my ticket, but I thought it was a worthwhile showing the replay for the number 3, Beau Cruz, because when we talked about Gun Pilot, a horse that he's cut back now, it seems to suit him well. He's a better 4-year-old than he was, in my opinion, as a 3-year-old. I think the thing with Beau Cruz is similar. They tried him at longer distances. They gave it a shot as a 3-year-old, and here as a 4-year-old, Alstall Jr. said, let's regroup. They tried him at mile and 70. He ran well. But then you put him here in the Grade 3 Commonwealth. He's much more forward from the gate. Was it 7 Ace? He decimates this field. This is pretty easy for him, in my opinion.
Yeah, I agree. He did. It was a very easy win for him. And you're right. It's the right way to look at him, especially if he's double-digit odds. Listen, they turned him back and it really worked for him. And that's what he wants to do. This feels like a tougher spot for him. But ultimately, how much tougher is it? I mean, there are no superstars in this race.
No, and one other thing to add here, we talked about Tejano Twist. He's the one that, in terms of budget, he scares me. I would love to use him in this spot. We talked about it. I think the deep closer thing can work for him. It can work against him. And I think the big thing is look at who he's faced in the past. I mean, we talk about kind of sprinters this year. Skelly's got to be high on many people's lists. Skelly's not in this field. He gets away from him. And even go down further down the page of him finishing 3rd behind who? Hoist the Gold, Cody's Wish. Nice horses in general. So I agree with what you had to say about him. He's 4-1 here on the morning line. We'll move now to the leg 4 of the sequence, race 11, the Grade 1 Turf Classic, mile and 1/8 here for 4-year-olds and upward. And this is, to me, a race that spreading may be the right decision to make.
Yeah, I think it's probably wide open. It's another race where trips are going to be important. And I think you're again in that situation where I think you just have to start out by looking at the horse drawn to the far outside post, Naval Power, for Godolphin and Appleby, who's run nothing but good races. He came back off of a really long layoff with an impressive win earlier this year over in Dubai. And then they come over here for the Maker's Mark last time, cut him back to a mile, yielding turf. He's in against Master of the Seas, who I guess is the best turf horse in North America right now. This horse ran a really good race to be second to him last time. I know he's got the far outside post, but isn't he the starting point here? Isn't he the horse to beat?
I absolutely agree. And before we get to his replay, though, first we have queued up another replay in here. So we're talking about turf. We're talking about Charles Appleby, but we're also going to talk about Chad Brown. He sends out 2 runners in here. He's got the 5 and the 6. And as we look at program trading, I know this was back in December at Del Mar. He does win the Grade 1 Hollywood Derby. And who does he defeat? Webslinger, who he has to face again in this field. Silver Knot, who comes back to win next time out. It's Chad off the layoff, but usually that's not a reason to be concerned.
Yeah, Chad's great off of layoffs. You don't concern yourself with that. The question with program trading, he was good as a 3-year-old for sure. I mean, nothing but good races. The question is, can he improve as a 4-year-old as much as his stablemate, the number 6, I'm Very Busy, as much as that horse has improved? Because I'm Very Busy has come back this year with 2 huge performances off the layoff. And I would say 2 performances that make him one of the horses to beat in here.
I agree. I mean, he was the runner-up in the Pegasus World Cup Turf Invitational behind Warm Heart. And then his win at the Fairgrounds in that Grade 2 event was just very impressive. I mean, he won with ease. He got 103 Beyer speed figure for that event. He's 4-1 on the morning line, but we talked about it. I agree. I mean, you have to start with Naval Power. And as we take a look at the Maker's Mark Mile at Keeneland, this is a good performance. Masters of the Seas just ends up being the best in here, but this is a horse that he was dead last early. He starts picking up horses slowly throughout this race, and he had yielding footing in that race. He was only going a mile. I think in the case of him, the big thing is that extra 8th will probably make the difference.
Yeah, I think it could. We'll see what kind of trip he can pull from the far outside here, but he runs really well in this race. He's clearly second best, and he did break pretty poorly in this race too, so hopefully he can get out of the gate a little bit better. The question I have for you about that race, Ashley, is, and maybe more so, like, what were your thoughts on the horse who finished 3rd in that race, Integration, who, listen, it's yielding turf for him. He's also cutting back in distance for that race. He's stuck on the outside the entire trip in that Maker's Mark Mile, while the 1-2 finishers both saved tons of ground. I mean, he was no threat at the end of that race, but did he run as poorly as it looks? If you go 2 back when he was behind I'm Very Busy at the Pegasus World Cup Turf, did not get a good trip in that race. He sort of feels like a horse whose 3 starts last year pointed him out as a horse who could be a major player in this division. So as this year goes on, I mean, is there a chance that this horse could really rebound, breaking from the inside this time if he can pull the right trip?
You'd have to think so. I mean, he lost so much ground last time out, and you wonder if does that make a difference? Does it put him in the winner's circle? I don't think so. I do
Yeah.
think Masters of the Seas would have been the better of the two, but it just would have put him closer in the end. And I think he's going to be sharper second start off the freshening. I think another thing to consider, that was his first time going off on ground that wasn't firm. We'll see what the weather forecast is
Yeah.
this weekend, but you're right. He was very highly regarded based on the first two races in his career, going into his third, and then he dominated there in the Hill Prince. And it's so intriguing in this race, in this division. Now you have a lot of these newly turned 4-year-olds in this field, and look at him who he's faced. Okay, I understand Naval Power is in front of him, but I'm Very Busy was in front of him once, but he was in front of him before, and he's
Right.
also had to face the other Chad. So I'm curious. I think he's a horse that I didn't use here in the pick 5, but I think in exotic wagers, depending on the price, I wouldn't be shocked if he goes off at higher to 5-1. And I think that would be intriguing to me, even if he is a little cold on the board. I thought 5-1 on the morning line. I don't want to say it's short, it's
Yeah.
fair, but I think this is a field where he might be able to offer better value.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. It'll be interesting. That is one of the more interesting parts about this race too. Is I don't really know how they're going to bet it. They could certainly maybe go overboard on that 11, who I personally think is the horse to beat. But I'm very interested in integration in this race. And then I just kind of didn't really want to spread around too much because I thought some of the other horses in here. Well, I respect some of the form and some of the races they've run. I do feel like if Naval Power shows up and integration gets back on track in this race, and listen, if I'm Very Busy just holds his form, some of these horses are in pretty big trouble.
Yeah, and I used a deep closer in here who gets himself in trouble. I always think Webslinger has the
Yeah.
talent and has the ability to get it done. Thought he'd offer value in here, and I know he's missed in his 2 starts this year, but in terms of the trip that he got in the Pegasus, I did not think it was good. I think he had some excuses in there. He was at least able to take a step forward, and we talked about it. I'm Very Busy was just simply the best at the fairgrounds in late March. So that is the 4th leg and the big one, Mike. We got to talk about the Kentucky Derby and field of 20. There's also eligible, seeing what happens with them. 1.25 miles here on the main track. And I mean, obviously it's the Derby, so you want to have some coverage, right? I would never have the guts to say I'm going one horse or maybe even 2 horses deep in the Derby, but overall, we haven't had much Derby conversation. What sort of camp are you in? Who are you gravitating towards?
Yeah, I agree. It feels like it's you get the Derby, you get 20 horses, and you just sort of. I think the instinct is to get as much coverage as you can because anything can happen, and we've seen crazy horses win this race in the past, and that's all. That's all very valid. I don't have any problem with anybody who looks at the race that way. This year's Derby, and I feel like maybe I'm most people don't agree with this take. Maybe they do. I don't know. I feel like you're on pretty solid ground with the favorites in this race. That's just how I looked at it. I think there are some interesting, maybe a couple of interesting bigger prices, but I feel like with Fierceness and Sierra Leone, I think you're on pretty solid ground. These horses have looked good through the prep season for the most part. They're the 2, we'll put it in quotes because I hate when people say this, but they're the 2 best horses in the race, in my opinion. And they have diverse running styles too. So you'll have one up front, you'll have one coming from the back. I felt like I was on pretty solid ground with those 2, and I want to sort of lean on them. And the only other horse that I want to use as far as pick 5s go is the number 19 Resilience, who I just feel like he's a horse who is getting better at the right time. He comes off of a career best performance in his most recent start. I get it. The Woodmore wasn't a super strong field. He got a great trip in there, but I thought he moved forward again. And I like the way he's coming into this race for a horse who's going to be a big price in here.
And I liked him in the Wood Memorial. And I thought, looking at the odds he went off at, that was a fair price, something I
Yeah.
was willing to take. I think the big thing is you look at Bill Motta's training style. He put blinkers on for that, and I think that made all the difference. He was still forward from the gate, but his rider was able to get him to relax. He did not have to be the first out of the gate, and he just pulled him back just a little bit and had him sit. And I think that worked out well for him. And I agree with you. I mean, I think Sierra Leone, and when you look at Fierceness, what they've been able to do visually, they've just been impressive as well, and how they do it, right? Different trips. Obviously, when you look at Fierceness in the Florida Derby, he dominated. It was visually impressive. I think the one thing is that when I saw the opening split for the quarter and the half, no one went with him, and maybe they couldn't go with him. So there's that argument as well. But I do feel like that helped his chances, right? I'm not saying that the talent isn't there, because when he is great, he is excellent. But I also don't want to pick a 5-2 morning line horse in the Kentucky Derby necessarily as my top pick. And the other horse you mentioned, Sierra Leone, second choice at 3-1. Let's show his most recent performance. And we talk about the visuals of this horse and how he covers the ground late Some horses, when you stretch them out, when they're trying to make up ground, it doesn't necessarily work out. But for him, it's worked out just about every single time. And I think the way he wins the Bluegrass here at Keeneland, this is what you want to see in that final race before the Derby.
Yeah, I agree. I feel like there's an argument to be made that he won the two best prep races on the way to this Derby, the Bluegrass and the Risen Star. And he won them both very impressively. I thought I really liked his performance here. I know he got a clean run into a fast pace, but he was the only one who made up any ground at all in that spot. Just thought I think he's looked really good to me in every one of his starts. He's only got 4 starts in his career, but to me, he's run really well all 4 times.
Now, the horse that I have a lot of interest in, and typically try not to pick out my Derby horse too early, but I've stayed on him for probably, I don't know, a month now, is Catching Freedom. I thought the Louisiana Derby, in terms of how he did it, was impressive. Did he look visually as impressive as Sierra Leone? No, I'll be honest, he did not. But I think the main thing is he was last for a majority of that race. And for this horse, I don't think that's necessarily his style. And when it comes to the Derby, I think a mid-pack sort of trip is what he's going to get and what they're going to aim for. And I think in some ways, gives him a jump on some others. Does it make a difference if Sierra Leone's covering the ground like that and does not have any traffic? Maybe not, but was very impressed with the Louisiana Derby. I think he can take a step forward. He's really done not too much wrong in his career, and it's all about getting good at the right time. You've put it in quotes. There can be the best horses, but it's all about who's the best on Saturday is. I think that's kind of the discussion, and who gets the best trip. So that one has my interest. I said if I was trying to find a sleeper, probably more in the exotics, but I had the wiggle room here in the pick 5. The 15, Domestic Product. I think he gets looked at and kind of tossed to the side because the times of those races aren't the flashiest, especially the opening quarters and the halves, both going in about 50 and 2 and 51. They're slow, but he's never been on the front in those races. He's actually had to close into some slow paces. And I thought the Tampa Bay Derby, in terms of what he had to do late, he looked good to me. And I know the Beyer came light as an 82. His career best is an 87. But hey, he has been in front of Fierceness before. And another one that I think might be able to get an okay trip in here.
Yeah, and you don't care about the Beyer for that last race either, because you just can't get a fast figure when they're going that slow on the pace. There's no way for the final time to be fast enough. I'm with you. I think he is, of the bigger prices, the really big prices, he's the most interesting one to me. Do you want to comment on Forever Young at all, the undefeated Japanese horse who's got a lot of buzz around him? I'm not using this horse, but I understand why other people might. There's a chance that he's really good.
There is a chance that he's really good. And, kind of looking at him and what he's been able to do, I think in comparison to the other Japanese runner, having the left and right hand experience, I think going into the Derby is interesting. You look at his last 2 wins specifically. We know he's been tested for class in those races, and he's run well. It's also interesting to me just to look at his WART tab. You don't see 6 furlongs and 119 and 3. They kind of seem like they let him do his thing, and they don't really grind on him in terms of his training. And look, it's paid off at this point. He's 5 for 5. I just always, have to take into some reservations with the Japanese runners coming here. It's a big field. With that said, if he's in the money, it necessarily wouldn't be a shock to me. But to me, I wasn't in love with them enough to kind of use them over others in here. If I had maybe a deeper budget, I probably would use Forever Young over TO Password. But I mean, it's worth noting that these runners are here. Japan is represented by 2 horses. We talk about the breeding program and the money that they're putting into the game. You're seeing them better represented now in these big days, whether it's the Breeders' Cup or Kentucky Derby Day with their runners.
Yeah, they're really pointing for the bigger races over here now. And the point's well taken. Forever Young, he's the one who's really been tested so far. He's the one that it seems like they really like over there.
Right.
And he just has a chance to be at least as good as our 3-year-olds. The other one, Teal Password, to me has absolutely no chance in this race. But Forever Young, he's a very interesting horse, and in some ways, maybe the most interesting horse in the race, because there really is a chance that he's this good.
And then just final question for you, weather forecast. We talk about the starting gate and the post positions meaning something or not meaning something. I'm in the camp of, I think it depends what post you get, what sort of trip you're going to work out, right? Based on your running style. I think that's where you have to be strategic, but I don't know how necessarily I dig into stats, and I love stats, but the weather is something that I do kind of factor into the Derby. There's some rain potentially in the forecast. We'll see what ends up happening. I think last I heard it was 30 or 40%. Is there anyone here that, in terms of maybe say outside of the pick 5, but just in general, that you'd be more intrigued if it was an off track?
No, I haven't really looked at it that way. I usually don't.
Yeah.
I suppose as far as the Derby goes, maybe the one horse. So I guess you're gonna want to go back and reevaluate whether you like him or not. If it rains, it's Mystic Dan at the rate, just because we already know he really likes a wet track, and he's got one huge race and his only start in the mud. So he was like the obvious one. But I don't care about post positions for the most part,
Right.
and I really, the wet track stuff. Yeah, I'll go back and look at it again if I have to, but I haven't looked at the race that way.
Yeah, I would agree with you though. Just off the top of my head, I think Mystic Dan would be the main one. Obviously, his best figure 101 was in the Southwest. So that is the 5 legs here of this pick 5 that gets kicked off in race number 8. And here's my ticket. I went a little bit on the skinnier side early. I mentioned I'm pretty heavy on the number 10 in race 10. I also use Hoist the Gold, so I went light in that race. I could also see people spreading deep. And to kick it off, I'm with you. I think Who Day is very nice. Top Connor has the ability to be a nice horse as well. So you can see 7, 8 in the Pat Day Mile. Then we go to the Turf in race number 9. I use the 5, 6, and the 11. Race 10, I mentioned. The 10 is probably the horse that I would use on top in anything. And I'll use probably place a win bet on this horse as well. And the 11, Hoist the Gold. Race 11, 6, 7, and 11 for me. I am afraid, though, in this spot of the 5. I did toss him here, and I'm hoping that doesn't come back to bite me later. But this is a ticket that I would punch myself and will punch myself. And then to wrap it up in the Derby, I used Sierra Leone, Catching Freedom, my top pick, Domestic Product, my bomb, and I had to use Fierceness as well. I would hate to get beat by him. He's the type of horse that I think he could, obviously be the winner, but I also think he could be trip compromised in this spot with having some pressure early. So for me, it's a $72 ticket. And Mike, your ticket's up next if you want to talk through it.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't do too much spreading either. I mean, I just found it hard to find a bunch of interesting horses in here. We talked about the Derby. Listen, I got the 2 favorites in there, and I actually don't think I'd be that disappointed if I made it through and I had the 2 and the 17. I'd probably just take my chances there, even though it's the most uninteresting thing in the world. But I want to have resilience in there. I'm a fan of that horse. I think he's getting better at the right time. Starting it out in the Pat Day. I don't know, man. I'm a Top Connor guy. I really liked his debut. So I'm really going to lean on him in this race. But I have Who Day in there also. I think Who Day is really interesting at a price. So I definitely want to have him on my tickets. The second leg, to me, was kind of all about Legend of Time. I'm just going to stay away from the Transylvania horses, although I realize they're good horses in that field for sure. And I won't be surprised when they run well, but I want to avoid them this time. I think Legend of Time's the horse to beat. Formidable Man is my long shot. I'm betting him probably to win in this race, and I'll use him with the 5. And I'll just use those 2 horses in the pick and hope I get through it. The 10th was the big spread race for me. I could have used more horses in this field, but I wound up using 4. We'll see how it shakes out. And then the Turf race. Listen, I'm Naval Power. I think he's probably the horse to beat. I'm really interested in Integration. I think he's going to run a lot better here from the rail. I did throw I'm Very Busy in there just because his last 2 races are so good. I don't want to lose to him, but there's a part of me that makes me want him to prove it again to me and run another big one here.
I think the thing that you mentioned about the 2 and the 17, using Sierra Leone and Fierceness in the Kentucky Derby, maybe not creative. I did the same thing, but I think when you look at the sequence as a whole, some people might play bigger tickets here, but to me, when you looked at maybe the Turf races, you look at the Turf Classic, that's a race where I'm probably more interested in the exotic wagers, the exactas and tries, and trying to figure out something that you either can play multiple times or you can spread maybe in a try and get a big price, because we talk about the pick 5 so much, but you can't forget about the verticals and the horizontals when you look at a sequence like this.
That's good advice no matter what, not just for Derby Day. That's good advice no matter what when you're betting the horses. You don't have to play every pick 5 just because sometimes they pay really well. Sometimes your biggest advantage is when you have one strong opinion in one race.
All right, so those were our pick 5 tickets. Don't forget, this gets started with race 8, ends in the Kentucky Derby. Best of luck with your wagers and best of luck this Saturday.